Meeting face to face can often be a turn-off. But occasionally, when you really look the other person in the eye, it can change them. In fact, it can also change you. When this happens at the summit, it sometimes begins a process of lasting historical change. What really matters is the chemistry between the leaders. The Cold War could easily have ended in World War III. Yet in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to cut their nuclear arsenals, and the Red Army withdrew peacefully from Eastern Europe. This extraordinary turnaround is often portrayed as the inevitable result of vast historical forces, especially the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. Yet I believe that the pace of the transition and its peaceful nature cannot be explained without understanding the interplay of personalities at the very top. And that all started here on Lake Geneva in November 1985, when two leaders, despite their bitterly opposed ideologies, somehow clicked. What went on behind the scenes when Mikhail Gorbachev met Ronald Reagan in Geneva reveals, I think, a reality at odds with popular misperceptions of these two leaders. Reagan was a notorious Cold Warrior, hated by the European left. Yet symmetry brought out the ardent peacemaker deep within him. Gorbachev, on the other hand, was no messiah, as so often painted in the liberal West. He didn't come to Geneva with much new thinking. Real change in Soviet attitudes happened as Gorbachev gained confidence in Reagan. But success is not achieved by statesmen who think they can do it all on their own. At Geneva, it was teamwork with and between advisors that turned a chemical bond into a chain reaction. This time, against all the odds, symmetry worked. This is the story of how the Cold War ended, not with a bang or a whimper, but a handshake. Summits are often disastrous. They can be bedeviled by illusion, as with Neville Chamberlain in 1938.
This will be the critical day in their talks. Mr. Khrushchev is expected to raise the question of Berlin and disarmament.
Or end in recrimination, as with Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961. And there was no reason to think that Geneva in 1985 would be any different. Each leader arrived with entrenched ideological convictions and real doubts about the other.
Heart of gold. Yes, he's got a great big heart of gold.
In 1981, America's new Republican president had ridden into town.
This is a man whose time has come, a man whose principles have been familiar to Americans for 30 years.
There seemed nothing subtle about Ronald Reagan. A B-movie actor, he'd made his political name as a relentless commie basher. In his very first press conference as president, he struck a belligerent note towards the Soviets.
The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat.
2 years later, Reagan famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
It seemed that the Cold War was getting hot. Reagan was reviled by the peace movement. Yet he was, I believe, in his own way, just as much of a peacenik. His was a complex personality. To understand Reagan, I think we have to appreciate that this fervent Cold Warrior also hated the bomb. Reagan believed that the Cold War policy of deterrence, based on mutually assured destruction, acronym MAD, was true madness. Close advisors doubted that he would have been willing to launch America's nuclear weapons even if the country were under attack. Reagan had been raised an evangelical Protestant with a profound sense of good and evil. His faith, though private, ran deep. And it was strengthened by what happened to him barely 2 months into his presidency.
President Reagan has been shot and wounded in an assassination attempt in Washington.
I wasn't there, but there were apparently 3 persons shot, and all I know on that is what I heard, what I got off the wire.
Well, as best we know, he's had 1 round into his body, in the left side.
1 bullet lodged an inch from his heart. His life was saved only because of quick action by the Secret Service and by surgeons in a nearby hospital. Reagan's quip on the operating table has gone down in American folklore. Please tell me you're Republicans. Afterwards, Reagan brooded over why God had spared him, eventually concluding it was to fulfill a providential mission, to leave the world a safer place. Reagan wanted to replace mutually assured destruction with mutual survival. He announced on nationwide TV a new project, truly his own idea, that he claimed would render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The White House called this multi-billion-dollar project the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. But critics doubted Reagan's sincerity and claimed SDI threatened to escalate the arms race into space. Star Wars was the label that stuck. And the fear in Moscow was that if America's missile shield worked, the US could mount a nuclear strike on what Reagan regarded as the evil empire without fear of retaliation. Here was the central paradox of the Reagan presidency. On the one hand, the fierce Cold Warrior, on the other, the would-be crusader for peace. The Soviets found it hard to decide which was the real Reagan. And that was understandable, because the president never resolved the confusion himself. Barely a year after pledging to make nuclear missiles obsolete, Reagan made an infamous gaffe while testing a radio microphone.
All right, my fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
But Reagan's rhetoric wasn't the only reason why summitry was slow to get going.
И вот он пришел в час боя.
Police had warned the demonstrators in Warsaw not to come onto the streets, but some 10,000 of them ignored the warning.
From the mountains of Afghanistan to the cities of Poland, the Soviets were still waging the Cold War. And the Soviet leadership, I think, was just not quite up to summit diplomacy. Leonid Brezhnev was now on his last legs, senile and incompetent. The man seemed like a metaphor for his ailing, bureaucratic regime. The so-called era of stagnation was the butt of many secret Russian jokes. In one of them, Brezhnev greets Mrs. Thatcher on her arrival in Moscow. Picking up his prompt card, he reads, "We welcome you, Mrs. Gandhi." An aide nudges him. "Mrs. Thatcher." Brezhnev glares. "We welcome you, Mrs. Gandhi." "Leonid Ilyich, she is not Mrs. Gandhi. She is Mrs. Thatcher." "You fool! I know that she is Mrs. Thatcher, but it says here Mrs. Gandhi." Brezhnev finally expired in November 1982. Reagan's hopes for a summit rose with the appointment of Yuri Andropov, a former head of the KGB, but also known as a would-be reformer. Yet Andropov died in February 1984. He'd been desperately ill with kidney failure. After his second Soviet state funeral in only 15 months, Vice President George Bush joked to US Embassy staff, "See you again, same time, next year." He was mistaken, but only by 1 month. The Soviet old guard had chosen as their next leader another geriatric, Konstantin Chernenko. Sure enough, Chernenko wheezed his way into the grave in March 1985. But it wasn't just the rapid turnover at the top and the distraction of planning state funerals that prevented summitry. The old men shared an old paranoia. They never forgot being invaded out of the blue by Hitler in 1941. The epic conflict cost 28 million dead. That's 1 in 7 of the pre-war population. That generation of Soviet leaders carried over the fear of surprise attack to the era of nuclear weapons and to a new enemy, the United States.
It was just before 9 o'clock as the plane bringing the first cruise missiles to Britain came into land at the end of its overnight flight across the Atlantic. A long crate was slid out of the back doors. It was the right length to accommodate crews The missiles had arrived.
The Politburo's anxiety peaked in November 1983. Rattled by new cruise and Pershing missile deployments in Western Europe and by Reagan's strong language, the Kremlin misinterpreted a NATO exercise as a sign that American bases had been placed on full alert. Reagan was depicted in the Russian media as the man willing and able to push the nuclear button, even as a modern-day Hitler.
When Reagan learned all this, he was genuinely shocked. For years, he'd been saying that the Soviets would stop at nothing, even war, to achieve their ends. Now he discovered that apparently they believed exactly the same about him.
With a new sense of Russians as fellow human beings, Reagan made a conciliatory broadcast that was a major departure.
The fact that neither of us likes the other system is no reason to refuse to talk. Living in this nuclear age makes it imperative that we do talk. Just suppose with me for a moment that an Ivan and an Anya could find themselves, say, in a waiting room or sharing a shelter from the rain or a storm with a Jim and Sally, and there was no language barrier to keep them from getting acquainted. Would they then debate the differences between their respective governments? Or would they find themselves comparing notes about their children and what each other did for a living?
By the time this almost schizoid president started his second term in January 1985, the peacemaker was in the ascendant.
I think that's just been arranged.
And after Chernenko's death, Reagan finally had someone to talk to in Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev was born in 1931, making him 30 years younger than Chernenko. With a different generation came a different mindset.
Обладающего выдающимися политическими и организаторскими способностями, громадным жизненным опытом.
Gorbachev was a member of the educated middle class that emerged under Nikita Khrushchev's reforms. A graduate in law from Moscow State University, he had risen rapidly within the Communist Party and pioneered reform of Russia's collective farms. Like Khrushchev, Gorbachev was sure that the Soviet system needed radical change. But there was a crucial difference. Unlike Khrushchev, he believed that communism had to evolve into something more like Western social democracy. Gorbachev was clever, confident, and articulate. A far cry from his predecessors. And with a wife to match. The chic and intellectual Raisa, gushed Western journalists, was the first Soviet leader's wife to weigh less than her husband. Margaret Thatcher was the first Western leader to be captivated by the Gorbachev magic when he visited London as Deputy General Secretary in December 1984.
I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together.
At Camp David, a few days later, Thatcher's briefing on this unusual Russian encouraged Reagan to propose a summit in Washington. Immediately, Gorbachev became Soviet leader. But getting to the summit would be heavy going. Like Reagan, Gorbachev was a complex character. He still believed profoundly in the basics of the communist faith. His goal was to remove the grim legacies of Stalinism and get back to what he characterized as the pure idealism of Lenin. Gorbachev's advisors also suspected that Reagan's invitation was simply propaganda by this Jekyll and Hyde Cold Warrior to wrong-foot his critics. Reagan had cried wolf too often to be taken seriously as a dove. Back in Washington, Gorbachev's hesitation played into the hands of hardliners. Reagan's split personality was reflected in his divided administration. Caspar Weinberger at Defense was skeptical of every Russian move. This vehement hawk didn't want a summit. If it had to happen, he wanted Gorbachev to come crawling, cap in hand, to the White House. But there were doves in Washington as well. Reagan's actress wife, Nancy, had devoted her life to Ronnie and was keen to dispel his image as a ruthless Cold Warrior. But pillow talk doesn't get you to the summit. Reagan needed a practical policymaker to help him turn dreams into reality, and a strong manager to resolve the battles within his cabinet. The man who took on these roles was his Secretary of State, George Shultz, a Washington heavyweight. Shultz looked like a kind of doleful bloodhound, but appearances were deceptive. A veteran of Nixon's cabinet, he knew how to survive in the Washington jungle. He was an academic economist, comfortable with big ideas, and as an experienced labor negotiator, he could haggle with the best and the worst of them. Shultz now persuaded Reagan to ignore the hawk's objections, and he convinced the Kremlin that America was serious about better relations. But, like Reagan, Gorbachev was operating within a dysfunctional team. The big obstacle to better relations with America was the foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko. A veteran of the Khrushchev era, Grim Grom, as he was known in the West, had been Gorbachev's kingmaker, and he warned Shultz that Gorbachev had a nice smile, but iron teeth. Yet he was the first to feel the new leader's bite. He was out within months. Gromyko was replaced by a virtual unknown with no diplomatic experience. Eduard Shevardnadze was a reformist party boss who had rooted out corruption in his native Georgia. Now he was phoned out of the blue by Gorbachev and summoned to Moscow. It was a breathtaking change, and clear proof of Gorbachev's personal power. The new leader recognized that he could not transform relations with the West as long as Gromyko was in charge. He needed a committed reformer loyal to himself. And being virtually an enlightened despot under the Soviet system, he could redirect policy in ways that Reagan and Shultz could only dream of. Shevardnadze proved a quick learner, and he soon forged a good working relationship with Schultz, his opposite number. The two sides agreed that Reagan and Gorbachev would meet in Geneva in November 1985. But was there anything for them to talk about? The media was profoundly skeptical. The key problem was Star Wars. Gorbachev himself warned that if the US didn't change its policy, Geneva would be pointless. But if America did abandon its plans for missile defense, he said the superpowers could cut their nuclear arsenals by half. There seemed little chance of a deal. The Washington hawks and doves were still battling it out for the ear of the president. Schultz managed to stop Weinberger going to Geneva, but Weinberger found a way to strike back. Weinberger wrote to the president, advising him to make no concessions on SDI or arms control. And his letter was leaked to the press. White House aides fumed that the defense secretary was trying to sabotage the summit. Successful summitry requires teamwork. The feuding undermined American diplomacy and sent signals to Gorbachev that Reagan wasn't serious. All in all, the omens for the summit did not look good. The American party flew into Geneva on Saturday the 16th of November, a full 2 days before the Soviets arrived. The president needed plenty of time to recover from jet lag. Reagan was 74, a full 20 years older than Gorbachev. And in July, he'd undergone an operation to remove a cancerous growth in his bowel. First encounters at the summit always generate a keen sense of anticipation. The mood before Geneva was rather like the hype when two heavyweight boxers square up for the big fight. And the world's press was speculating that Reagan was about to meet his match. The Soviet leader was clearly sharp and dynamic, and he was already charming public opinion across Western Europe. Reagan had been dubbed the Great Communicator because of his command of the conversational set-piece speech. But he was known to have a short attention span and to be fuzzy on detail. Alarmed by his reliance on slogans when speaking about the Soviets, his aides had subjected the president to what they jokingly called Soviet Union 101, the equivalent of an introductory university course about the country. He wrote in his diary,
"Lord, I hope I'm ready and not overtrained."
He and his team even secretly rehearsed summit scenarios.
Before we get started, can I say something about this? I would not want, under any circumstances, that any of us mention to the press in any shape or fashion that we rehearsed the president today or that he went through play acting with somebody taking the part of Gorbachev. That's the last thing in the world we need out in the press. So, for heaven's sakes, keep it in this room, please.
Would Gorbachev and his chic intellectual wife upstage the senior citizens from Hollywood? The world's media was obsessed with these questions. And even among Reagan's entourage, there were frissons of anxiety about how the meetings would go.
Well, I tell you, I read the clips this morning, and particularly the Washington Post, and as far as I'm concerned, they're pro-Gorbachev. They're not,
So we've known that for a long
they're
time.
not on our side.
They haven't chosen sides.
It's not no.
Day one of the summit took place at Fleur d'Eau, a secluded lakeside chateau chosen by the Americans. Reagan arrived early, ready to welcome Gorbachev at 10 o'clock. He paced around the entrance hall, keeping his overcoat on for warmth. Then, as the Soviet limo screeched to a halt outside, he took off his coat and strode out into the cold. The two leaders shook hands warmly, but what struck the world media was the image of Gorbachev muffled in coat and scarf, and Reagan looking, if anything, like his junior, a picture of vigor in his elegant suit. Through gritted teeth, Gorbachev kept smiling for the cameras. But he knew that the president had won the first round in their PR battle. Yet White House staff could breathe a sigh of relief. Whatever Reagan's stage nerves beforehand, it's clear that the old actor knew how to turn in a performance when it really mattered.
I just was sleeping when it was time to work in my session. Then I think that both the president and myself have looked round and believe that
After innumerable media photos, Reagan ushered Gorbachev into a side room. There, accompanied only by an interpreter on each side, the two leaders had their first chance to size each other up. This chat was intended to last only 15 minutes, but it ran on and on. White House staff began to get anxious. After 40 minutes, the president's assistant, Jim Kuhn, asked Schultz if perhaps he should go in and try to move things on. "If you're dumb enough to do that," the Secretary of State barked back, "you shouldn't be in your job."
Your meeting has been going on much longer than planned. Why?
Because whoever was scheduling didn't allow enough time.
The first plenary session finally started at 11:30. The two sides sat opposite each other, wall on wall as the American diplomats called it, at a long oval table, flown in specially from the UN in New York. Gorbachev wanted to set out the big issues. Reagan wanted to deal with the mutual suspicions that needed to be overcome first. Overall, the language was polite and restrained. Even so, the president got in a few digs. Maybe the Soviet Union doesn't want war, but it seems to want to get its own way. Gorbachev was not impressed. He told his advisors afterwards, "This man is a dinosaur." Each side took lunch separately, so as to fine-tune their tactics for the afternoon's talks, which would address the controversial American development of SDI, the anti-missile shield in space. Now Gorbachev took the gloves off. He denounced America's primitive approach to world problems, He ridiculed Reagan's claims about a Soviet arms buildup, insisting that the United States had far more nuclear weapons. It was Reagan's turn. He said that Gorbachev's presentation illustrated the lack of trust between them. Leafing through his prompt cards, he reeled off one example after another of Soviet double-dealing. From World War II to the invasion of Afghanistan. Gorbachev said later that the transcript read like #1 communist and #1 imperialist trying to out-argue each other. The atmosphere was getting hot. It was rather like Kennedy and Khrushchev trading accusations in Vienna nearly a quarter of a century before. But Geneva proved very different from Vienna. Suddenly, Reagan diffused the tension by suggesting that they take a walk outside. The American team had planned this beforehand for just such a moment. Gorbachev readily accepted, though remembering the morning he wouldn't put on his overcoat until he was sure that the president was going to do the same. Outside, they chatted about Reagan's Hollywood years. The president joked, "I didn't just make B-movies, I made a few good ones." Gorbachev said that he'd recently seen the film King's Row and liked it very much. This was a shrewd move, because Reagan considered that his best movie, famous for his line on discovering that both his legs had been amputated, "Where's the rest of me?" The two men strolled down to a pool house by the lake. This now derelict outbuilding was the venue for what Reagan dubbed the Fireside Summit. The president handed Gorbachev a translation of the latest American arms control proposal, and they quickly got back to the Missile Defense Initiative. The Soviet leader hammered away at the folly of space weapons. Reagan kept insisting that SDI was purely defensive. Gorbachev came back at him with real emotion. What, he asked, was the logic of starting an arms race in a new arena? This got Reagan onto his favourite image of the spear and the shield. The president insisted they should seek to rid the world of the nuclear threat, but retain a shield just in case there was an unforeseen return to nuclear missiles. Gorbachev said he could understand the president's feelings at a human level. The idea of strategic defense had clearly captured the president's imagination. But, speaking as a political leader, Gorbachev said he couldn't possibly agree. America, he went on, could launch its nuclear spear and then use its shield as protection when the Soviets threw their spear in retaliation. In other words, America would be in a position to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union. Before the meeting, when Schultz warned Reagan that Gorbachev would mount an all-out attack on SDI, the president wrote in his diary, "Well, this will be a case of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object." But instead of letting an ideological collision break up another summit, the two leaders now pulled back. They simply agreed to talk another day. Afterwards, Gorbachev talked about having another summit, so Reagan invited him to come to Washington. Gorbachev accepted and suggested a return visit to Moscow. Reagan's advisors were astonished when the president announced that they'd already fixed up another summit. He ribbed Schultz about his diplomatic coup for weeks. On the gravel, they shook hands and looked each other in the eye. The chemistry was palpable. At the first session, Gorbachev told his aides, he saw only blank, uncomprehending eyes as the president mumbled certain banalities from his paper. But as the day went on, he began to discern another Reagan. In the pool house, he said, they'd managed to engage in a genuinely human conversation. The president, for his part, enjoyed the Soviet leader's passion and animation. Reagan told hardline staff,
I can't just keep poking him in the eye. You could almost get to like the guy. I keep telling myself I mustn't do it because he could turn.
Their growing rapport was strengthened that evening at a dinner hosted by the Soviets. But the same could not be said of their wives. Nancy Reagan and Raisa Gorbachev were the proverbial chalk and cheese. An ex-Hollywood starlet obsessed by astrology and a PhD in sociology who lectured about Marxism-Leninism. Lectured was in fact the operative word about Raisa. Nancy found it hard to get a word in edgeways, and she was no shrinking violet. Afterwards, Nancy exploded in fury. Who does that dame think she is? On day 2, the venue shifted to the Soviet mission. Before the plenary session, the two leaders had another one-on-one.
Is he tough? How are his teeth? Are they iron?
And this time, the ideological Reagan was uppermost. He struck a hawkish line on human rights, to the irritation of Gorbachev, who considered it largely propaganda. The atmosphere was noticeably less cordial. This was the morning after the night before, and neither man was at his best. Reagan had drunk too much coffee for breakfast and was feeling distinctly uncomfortable. The meeting dragged on for 70 minutes. By the time it ended, both men were in a bad mood. The next session soon came back to the crunch issue, missile defense, SDI. Gorbachev again warned about an arms race in space. Reagan insisted that he was only talking about research and he would share the results. It was the same clash as the day before, but this time there was no respite, no walk to the pool house. They just kept slugging it out, and the talks, which had begun irritably, became ever more heated. Gorbachev, a charmer in public, could flare up angrily in private. Why don't you believe me, he demanded, when I say that the Soviet Union will never attack? Reagan started to respond. Please answer me, Mr. President. What is your answer? And again, before Reagan could get going, I want an answer. Why don't you believe me? Finally, Reagan got a word in. Look, he said, no one can tell the American people they should rely on personal faith rather than sound defense. It was a forceful point. Gorbachev shifted ground. Why should I believe that you mean what you say about sharing SDI research, when you don't even share your advanced technology with your own allies? Let's be more realistic. Once again, he went over the Soviet offer. Deep cuts in nuclear arsenals if the United States would abandon the Firebird of missile defense. They had locked horns. There was a long silence. Maybe for 30 seconds, the two men stared, red-faced, at each other. Then Gorbachev threw down his pencil, flung up his arms and said, "Mr. President, I don't agree with you, but I can see that you really mean it." He added quietly, "Maybe this has all grown a little bit heated. I was just trying to convey to you our concern about SDI." This was an extraordinary moment. On the face of it, a tactical victory for Reagan. But at a deeper level, I think that Gorbachev had shown imaginative leadership. He deliberately backed down in order to allow the larger dialogue to continue. Elsewhere in the Soviet mission, the two wives were enduring another tea party.
By the time we were going to part, it seemed to me that we have been knowing each other for 100 years.
Nancy was puzzled by the usually glamorous Raisa's severe outfit. But this was the only session that would be photographed for Soviet consumption. Raisa had dressed in the garb of a Russian teacher to avoid inflaming criticism back home of her bourgeois affectations. At dinner that evening at Reagan's residence, the atmosphere between the two leaders was convivial.
Okay, hold back there, Scotty. Nobody's going anywhere yet.
Reagan said that he and Gorbachev were meeting for the first time at this level and therefore had little practice. But having read the history of previous summits, he'd concluded that earlier leaders hadn't accomplished very much. With Gorbachev nodding in agreement, Reagan suggested that the two of them should simply say, "To hell with the past. We'll do it our way and get something done." So what had been achieved? The main thing, I believe, was the very real chemistry between the leaders, despite their major differences on policy. Unlike Khrushchev and Kennedy, these leaders had moved beyond one-upmanship, point-scoring and rhetoric, and they were determined to continue negotiating. There were also other, less eye-catching developments fixed up by Shevardnadze and Schultz. Cultural and educational exchanges involving scientists, teachers and sports teams. It's true that nothing had been decided on the vital questions of arms control. But the success of summits can be measured in their symbolism as well as their substance. The visible rapport between the two leaders created a profound shift in public perceptions, building confidence between East and West. This was summitry as a truly humanizing force. So here, on Lake Geneva, superpower relations began to thaw. But there were to be no quick, easy successes. It had been agreed that Geneva was not to be a one-off summit. But the Soviet leader was unwilling to go to Washington until Reagan promised an arms control agreement that included SDI. Yet the president would not give up on research into weapons in space. The good vibes began to fade. In desperation, Gorbachev suggested another quick meeting at Reykjavik in Iceland in October 1986 to see if he and Reagan could hammer out common guidelines for their arms control negotiators. Gorbachev now offered much deeper cuts in nuclear weapons. Reykjavik was a dramatic moment. Both leaders got carried away with schemes for radical disarmament, even talking about eliminating all nuclear weapons within 10 years. But the high hopes proved illusory. When Gorbachev insisted that missile defense be researched not in space, but only in the laboratory, the president adamantly refused. 11 intoxicating hours of summitry ended in bitter recrimination. But Reykjavik didn't end their new dialogue. I think, strangely enough, the emotional outbursts exposed their real characters, and that created a much deeper level of trust. Gorbachev no longer sneered at times about the president as a fool and a clown. And Reagan was confirmed in his Geneva hunch that the human Gorbachev would win out over the Leninist. Each discerned more clearly the would-be peacemaker in the other. And in private, the diplomats and foreign ministers kept talking. Shevardnadze joked that he and Schultz lost count somewhere around 35 or 37 meetings. That's why I believe the Geneva summit had been so significant. Its success lay not just in breaking the ice between the leaders, but in fostering a culture of negotiation right across the Cold War divide. And Star Wars became less of an obstacle. After the Democrats gained control of Congress in November 1986, it was unlikely that the Missile Defense Initiative would get off the ground. Reagan's credibility, meanwhile, was severely damaged by news that his administration had sold weapons to Iran to help finance aid to Central American anti-communists. He needed the good PR of a summit. Gorbachev's readiness to come to Washington was a chance to boost Reagan's flagging domestic reputation.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan.
The December 1987 summit proved a historic breakthrough. The treaty to scrap intermediate-range nuclear weapons was the first agreement actually to reduce weapons stockpiles. It showed that the process of negotiation at the summit and lower down was now bearing fruit. In the summer of 1988, Reagan visited Moscow. During a walkabout with Gorbachev through Red Square, Reagan was asked whether he still thought the Soviet Union was an evil empire. "No," he replied firmly, "I was talking about another time, another era." The old ideologue could sense that the Cold War was coming to an end. That became clear in 1989, when the communist regimes began creaking towards democracy. In China, the leaders cracked down on political protest with ruthless brutality. But in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, as reform turned to revolution, Gorbachev chose not to use force to stop the overthrow of communism. And the experience of summitry was a crucial factor in his thinking. The Soviet Union was in a mess. But I believe it could have toughed out the next few years and kept up the arms race. Yet Gorbachev was convinced that the new relationship he'd forged with the West was more important than clinging on to the Soviet empire. If Gorbachev had seen just the old Cold Warrior across the table, he would probably have held tight to Eastern Europe. But Reagan recognized the potential peacemaker in Gorbachev and reached out to him. The president's folksy goodwill helped create a new climate in which a superpower showdown became unthinkable. Both leaders also understood that successful summitry was a process to be worked at over time, and that it had to be grounded in contacts at all levels, not just the very top. Schultz, Shevardnadze and their teams did much of the spadework that made agreements possible. It was Neville Chamberlain who was the pioneer of summitry, with his gambit of a one-to-one meeting with Hitler. But Reagan and Gorbachev used their advisors to make summitry work as an instrument for peaceful change. Leaders who operate as Lone Rangers usually fail.
To keep the blood flowing, we also gonna let these fascists behind us know what democracy looks like. So y'all ready, huh?
Yet since the Cold War, these hard-won lessons appear to have been forgotten.
What do we want?
Some states that sponsor terror or seeking or already possess weapons of mass destruction.
Let's be under no doubt whatever. Saddam Hussein has acquired weapons of mass destruction over a long period of time.
The policy of my government is the removal of Saddam.
Recently, I think that inept summitry between self-confident leaders has helped mire Britain and America in a botched war in Iraq. Tony Blair marginalized his diplomats. He failed to think through the post-war scenarios, and he didn't pin down George Bush at the bargaining table. The roadmap for Middle East peace that Blair took as part payment for British support in the Iraq War proved about as valuable as Neville Chamberlain's notorious piece of paper. Summitry has always turned on the skills and egos of politicians. Sometimes the results have been disastrous. But the Geneva meeting reminds us that when the chemistry works and the follow-up is right, what Churchill called a parley at the summit can indeed make history.
Andrew Graham Dixon continues his journey through the art of Spain tomorrow night at 9. But next tonight, we're sticking in 85 with the rock and roll years.
To lie, to cheat.
2 years later, Reagan famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
It seemed that the Cold War was getting hot. Reagan was reviled by the peace movement. Yet he was, I believe, in his own way, just as much of a peacenik. His was a complex personality. To understand Reagan, I think we have to appreciate that this fervent Cold Warrior also hated the bomb. Reagan believed that the Cold War policy of deterrence, based on mutually assured destruction, acronym MAD, was true madness. Close advisors doubted that he would have been willing to launch America's nuclear weapons even if the country were under attack. Reagan had been raised an evangelical Protestant with a profound sense of good and evil. Geneva, in November 1985, when two leaders, despite their bitterly opposed ideologies, somehow clicked. What went on behind the scenes when Mikhail Gorbachev met Ronald Reagan in Geneva reveals, I think, a reality at odds with popular misperceptions of these two leaders. Reagan was a notorious Cold Warrior, hated by the European left. Yet summitry brought out the ardent peacemaker deep within him. Gorbachev, on the other hand, was no messiah, as so often painted in the liberal West. He didn't come to Geneva with much new thinking. Real change in Soviet attitudes happened as Gorbachev gained confidence in Reagan. But success is not achieved by statesmen who think they can do it all on their own. At Geneva, it was teamwork with and between advisors that turned a chemical bond into a chain reaction. This time, against all the odds, summitry worked. This is the story of how the Cold War ended. His faith, though private, ran deep. And it was strengthened by what happened to him barely 2 months into his presidency.
President Reagan has been shot and wounded in an assassination attempt in Washington.
But there were apparently 3 persons shot, and all I know on that is what I heard, what I got off the wire.
Well, as best we know, he's had 1 round into his body, in the left side.
1 bullet lodged an inch from his heart. His life was saved only because of quick action by the Secret Service and by surgeons in a nearby hospital. Reagan's quip on the operating table has gone down in American folklore. Please tell me you're Republicans. Afterwards, Reagan brooded over why God had spared him, eventually concluding it was to fulfill a providential mission, to leave the world a safer place. Reagan wanted to replace mutually assured destruction with mutual survival. He announced on nationwide TV a new project, truly his own idea, that he claimed would render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
What if free people
Meeting face to face can often be a turn-off. But occasionally, when you really look the other person in the eye, it can change them. In fact, it can also change you. When this happens at the summit, it sometimes begins a process of lasting historical change. What really matters is the chemistry between the leaders. The Cold War could easily have ended in World War III. Yet in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to cut their nuclear arsenals, and the Red Army withdrew peacefully from Eastern Europe. This extraordinary turnaround is often portrayed as the inevitable result of vast historical forces, especially the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. Yet I believe that the pace of the transition and its peaceful nature cannot be explained without understanding the interplay of personalities at the very top. And that all started here on Lake, not with a bang or a whimper, but a handshake. Summits are often disastrous. They can be bedeviled by illusion, as with Neville Chamberlain in 1938.
This will be the critical day in their talks. Mr. Khrushchev is expected to raise the question of Berlin and disarmament.
Or end in recrimination, as with Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961. And there was no reason to think that Geneva in 1985 would be any different. Each leader arrived with entrenched ideological convictions and real doubts about the other.
Heart of gold. Yes, he's got a great big heart of gold.
In 1981, America's new Republican president had ridden into town.
This is a man whose time has come, a man whose principles have been familiar to Americans for 30 years.
There seemed nothing subtle about Ronald Reagan. A B-movie actor, he'd made his political name as a relentless commie basher. In his very first press conference as president, he struck a belligerent note towards the Soviets.
The only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime,